Hello, everyone. We're just going to give a few minutes for people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. Wait about 3 to 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give a few minutes for people to join, and then we'll get started here. Just thanks for your patience. Okay, everyone. Those of us who joined, we're just going to wait another minute or so for a few more people to join in, and then we'll get started. See a few more trickling in now. Okay, we have a good number of people here. We'll begin now. My name is Ben Pero. Nice to meet you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to today's webinar. Welcome. On behalf of YouGov, I want to thank you all for attending. My name is Ben Pero. I'm a senior sales director here at YouGov, covering gaming and esports for our gaming esports sector in North America. And I'm going to be moderating the Q&A section of our webinar towards the end. We're here today to share findings from our recently launched Gaming Influencers Report to discuss insights on the global gaming influencer landscape for the US market specifically. Before we go any further, just a couple notes on housekeeping. Any questions at any point during the presentation, please submit them into the chat. We'll have some time towards the end to address those, and anything we don't get to, we'll follow up directly. We're also going to be recording this session so we can share it with our wider audience afterwards. Copies of these slides will be available to you afterwards as well. And so without any further ado, let me introduce today's speaker for this webinar. The speaker joining me is Nicole Pike. She's our Global Sector Head of Gaming and Esports here at YouGov. Nicole, I work with Nicole every day. She's the best, a bit of a celebrity in the gaming and esports space, and always a pleasure to speak with her. So Nicole, without further ado, pass the mic.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate the introduction and looking forward to chatting with you in the Q&A session. And thank you everyone for joining. Excited to share the content we have put together today. So as Ben mentioned, we are using this webinar as kind of a capstone, closing up our three-part report series on the global gaming influencer market. So presumably, since you're attending, you've received the first 2 reports. The third actually goes live or went live earlier today. So we'll get to see a sneak peek of some of that content at the end of the presentation. And I believe we'll also be pasting the link to download that third report if you haven't already received it directly in your inbox in the chat. But without further ado, let's get right into this webinar. One quick thing worth noting, this is the US or Americas focused webinar. We do have slightly different versions running tomorrow and Thursday for Europe and APAC. So if you're interested in attending those or in the content that's in any of those, feel free to reach out or check out our website, and you'll have all the information available there. But let's get right into the content. Let's see. Okay. So as Ben mentioned, I lead our esports and gaming sector globally here at YouGov, and essentially that means supporting all of our data sources as well as our clients that are involved in the esports and gaming industry, whether that's clients who are endemically gaming publishers involved in the esports ecosystem, or those who are advertising, sponsoring, producing media, et cetera, around the space. So my job is to make sure that YouGov is collecting and offering all the right data sources to help you as clients and stakeholders in the esports and gaming space make great decisions. And the way that we build all that data out and how we're collecting and analyzing that is through our YouGov platform and network of panels and coverage of markets around the world. So YouGov is, for those who haven't encountered us before outside of just this report and webinar series, YouGov is the most complete consumer data and analytics system on the planet. And the way that we manage to have such complete coverage is through our proprietary online panels that we manage and run surveys on every single day, 365 days a year in over 70 markets worldwide. Our YouGov panels are 17 million members plus strong, and we're collecting over 1 million data variables across all of those members. For those who have worked with YouGov before, one of the biggest benefits of that is that we're able to connect a lot of different data points that we have about our consumers and all the different places we collect that information into one big data cube that brings great value to our clients. And today's webinar will be all about showcasing some of that content and through some different sources that we'll look at here in a bit. The coverage for today's webinar, we'll be looking at 17 different markets worth of data, but YouGov as a whole has coverage all over the world in over 70 markets. And the data connectivity that I mentioned is really foundationally built on 2 of our core syndicated products that we offer. YouGov Profiles, which allows us to understand consumers in everything they do in a 360-degree way, including how they interact with esports and gaming, as well as YouGov Brand Index, which is a daily brand tracker where we're tracking nearly 2,000 brands around the world every single day, including several gaming franchises, publishers, and different gaming content providers. We combine all that with the ability to recontact consumers in a more custom way, as well as audience data to allow you to execute on ad targeting against those audiences, and much, much more. Today's agenda will briefly look at the methodology for the research that we put together on gaming influencers. That was the foundation of our report series in this webinar, and really look at that in 3 different ways. We'll start with the overall reach of gaming influencers, then move into understanding more about who is actually following gaming influencers, who are their fans, who are their dedicated audiences that are engaging with them ongoing. And then what I'm sure many of you here on the call are most interested in, the value of gaming influencers and their audiences to marketers. And then Ben will jump back on at the end for some Q&A. So please make sure to pop your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end. So briefly, just so you understand the data that we're looking at as we go through, in July of this year, we conducted a survey in 17 global markets across our proprietary YouGov panels, and you'll see the markets that are represented here a bit later in the presentation. This covered nearly 20,000 respondents in just one wave of surveys. And of course, we being as careful as YouGov is about representativity and the quality of our panels, we made sure that all of the data that was fielded was among a representative population in each of the markets. For a few of those, it is online only representative. I'll try to call those out because you will see the data look a little bit different for those. But really wanted to take a look kind of top down at the overall size and scope of the gaming influencer economy through that NatRep research. But what we've done is, in addition to that, supplemented all of the data that we collected from those survey respondents, as well as other respondents that we have in our YouGov panel ecosystem, to look at some different takes on gaming influencers and the different brands that are engaging, how people who follow gaming influencers are engaging with other types of content in other industries. And we've pulled all that together, certainly much more broadly in the report series. So I encourage you, if you haven't downloaded those, to do so. But even here today, some snippets. So I'll kind of talk through some different data sources and products that YouGov offers gaming and esports data in as we go through. All right, with that, let's jump right into the first part of the webinar, which is going to look at the overall reach of gaming influencers. And I think, before we even get to that point, it's really important to understand the size of the overall influencer economy globally. And briefly, when we're talking about influencers, we're looking at essentially personalities who consumers engage with, typically through either short form or live stream longer form content, who are representing brands, advertisers, sponsors, products in some way, of course, through the engaging content so that they offer to their fan base. So the first thing we did to understand kind of where the influencer economy is around the world today, it's certainly been rising over the past several years across a number of different influencer categories, and the data here reflects that. So over 4 in 10 adults globally are following some type of influencer, not specifically gaming, but some type of influencer today through typically social media, online platforms, but certainly not exclusively. And you can see that obviously varies quite widely across different markets around the world. This webinar focused on the Americas and specifically a lot of our data in the US. You can see that nearly 3 in 10 US adults follow some type of influencer today. Now, when we get narrower and look at what percent of the global population is following gaming influencers specifically, nearly 1 in 10, so 9% of adults, so 18 plus consumers globally, are following gaming influencers. And you can see how that stacks up among all the different types of influencers there are today. And there are a lot of them and then some. This is kind of an abbreviated list, but you can see around the world, the top influencer type followed for any age adult is actually food related influencers, health, celebrity, travel, fashion. There's a lot that are kind of in this 10% of global adults range. But where it starts to get really interesting is when we look at gaming influencers and how strong of a following they have across different demographic groups around the world. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, gaming influencers are the 11th most common influencer type followed among broad adults globally. But when you split it up among males versus females around the world, we actually see, and you can see here at the bottom, this is the rankings amongst all those different influencer types we saw on the prior screen. 12% of males around the world follow gaming influencers, but for males who follow influencers, that is actually the most commonly followed type of influencer, or tied for, I should say. So gaming influencers and the concentration that we see of that audience is largely based in the male population around the world. Conversely, you can see for females, it's actually one of the least common types of influencers followed. But as we'll see in some slides later, there is some pretty distinct differentiation by market for that particular gender trend. We look at consumers ages 18 to 24. Again, of any gender, we see that gaming influencers rank 6 in terms of the type of influencer followed, with about 20% of that overall 18 to 24 audience following that type of influencer. And you can see certainly that age group stands out versus ages 25 plus, again, across a male-female combined audience, where we see gaming influencers ranking lower in terms of where the type of influencers followed. But worth noting, and this is that last data point here at the far bottom right of the slide, among men ages 18 to 34, gaming influencers, again, are the top influencer type followed, with almost 1 in 4 following gaming influencers. So in terms of the overall kind of size and scope of the gaming influencer economy, heavily concentrated when we look at it from a global perspective in that young male audience. Breaking that down a little bit further, let's look at how other influencer types stack up versus gaming influencers among males 18 to 34 globally. And you can see, again, as I mentioned, ranked number 1, but we can see just how strong the power of gaming influencers is among this demographic. Sports and music influencers are the next most commonly followed type at 20%, and then it goes down quite substantially from there. And in fact, this is at a global level, but in 12 of the 17 markets that we ran this survey, gaming influencers were the top influencer type followed by males 18 to 34. So this isn't just necessarily concentrated in a few markets or a particular region around the world. This is really a global trend that we're seeing, the stronghold of gaming influencers among young males. We also have a teen product here at YouGov that we launched recently in the US. It's called Teen Profiles. So it is a teenage version among teens age 13 to 17 of our base profiling tool, syndicated profiling tool that we have. And we pulled in a little bit of data from that as well. It's a separate tool, but we did mimic the same question structure so we could compare the data among US teens with some other US data we have that I'll show here in a bit. And just for a point of reference, as I'm sure many of you, especially if you're marketers, know, the influencer economy is just absolutely huge among American teens these days. So 2/3 of US teens are following some type of influencer. And if you recall, looking back to that stat among the US adult population, that was only 29%. So really important part of how teens are spending their time and consuming content and finding out among new products here in the US. In the US, it's actually slightly more common for female teens to be following influencers versus males. And then when we take a look specifically at gaming influencers among US teens, we see that 36% of US teens follow gaming influencers. It is the second most commonly followed type of influencer behind music. And when we look at that among, and you can see here in the bottom left, males versus females, gaming influencers also rank second among males, but that stat, that 45% is pretty staggering. So nearly half of US male teens are following some type of gaming influencer. So if we think about, if that kind of common thought of gaming being a niche, a niche area, or those teens sitting in their parents' basement, time to rethink that point of view. We are seeing gaming influencers being a huge part of teens' consumption of social media, as well as teen males' source of information about new things. As I mentioned earlier, we definitely see some distinct trends by country that are worth pointing out. So the data we just looked at was in the US, but looking at a more kind of representative view, you can see that global percent of 9% of the global population following gaming influencers that we mentioned earlier. You can see that varies quite widely. So for example, in markets like China, where to note this is online population data, as well as Indonesia, we're seeing upwards of 20% of the overall adult population following gaming influencers, whereas at the lower end of things, a number of European markets, Sweden, Great Britain, Denmark, are below 5%. But then again, when we look at that following among males ages 18 to 34, kind of normalize things a bit, as we know that population spreads are different across different countries around the world. We see some really interesting trends as well. So for example, in Hong Kong, a very heavy male young following rate of gaming influencers, whereas again, Great Britain continues through a lot of the data that we've seen actually to be on the lower end, even among that core demographic in terms of the following of gaming influencers in that market. Okay, so now that we've taken a bit of a peek at the reach of gaming influencers and where we really see their attention and audience sitting, let's take a closer look at exactly who is following gaming influencers. And some of this is going to be just a slightly different way of looking at the previous data. So I'll try to get through that so we can move to some more interesting things around their characteristics, why they follow, etc. So the first thing to take a look at is among those who follow different influencers globally. So you can see here on the left-hand side, following of any influencer type at a global level is actually fairly gender neutral. So we see 53% of adults who follow influencers around the world are males. 47% are males, 53% are females. What really stands out for gaming influencers is gaming influencers of any influencer type that we've tested are skewed most heavily male in terms of who is following them. So about 70%, 69% of followers globally of gaming influencers are male. Of course, on the opposite end of that, we see things like fashion, beauty, probably not unexpected that those skew substantially female, but that really heavy skew of following gaming influencers for male is interesting, especially when you think about the overall population of gamers as a whole tends to be a bit more gender neutral, generally in that kind of 55% male range. So relative to overall gaming, influencers are definitely attracting a more male audience. But again, we do see some interesting differences by country. So when we look at, and I think the dichotomy we see here is particularly interesting. So Indonesia had a really high following rate of gaming influencers, but interestingly, it doesn't necessarily translate into them being attractive or appealing to both males and females. It's still the following in that particular market is still very male heavy, whereas in Denmark, where we had overall low rates of following, we see a similar trend, very concentrated toward males. Looking at the US, since we are focused in this webinar a bit more on America's data, we see that 64% of those who follow gaming influencers are male, and that's fairly consistent with, for example, what we see in terms of a gender skew of people who play games on consoles or gaming PCs in the US, just as a point of reference. Looking at our teen data in the US, just again to provide a little bit more context. First thing that's kind of interesting is that for teens, we actually see males are slightly more likely to follow any type of influencer versus females, which was actually the opposite among adults, although a very small difference. And what we see among teens is similar to among the adult population. Gaming influencer followers do skew heavily male for teens, but not quite as male as sport influencers. So interesting to see kind of those two in particular continue to be clustered toward that heavy male end of things. We talked about this a little bit earlier, so I'll try not to spend too much time on it, but one important thing to note is just how heavily skewed toward Gen Z, and even to a certain extent millennials, gaming influencer followers are. So you can actually see here in this kind of greenish color of any influencer type that we've looked at on a global level, gaming influencers are most likely to attract 18 to 24-year-olds. So a third of their overall audience are 18 to 24s. If you look at 18 to 34, we're all the way up to 70%, which again is the highest of any influencer type followed. So when we get to the next section where we're talking about kind of the impact that gaming and influencers can have for marketers, really important to keep in mind kind of that reach versus resonance piece, and really the ability to target a narrow, concentrated demographic that we see with gaming influencers more so than any influencer type based on this data. Once again, this all varies a bit by country. If we look specifically at the US, we see that over 80% of gaming influencer followers are aged 18 to 34 in the US. And this is really consistent with data that, for example, Twitch has put out on their overall user base, but just important to note that heavy concentration. Speaking of Twitch, we took a look at, so kind of moving away from the demographics and moving more into where fans and audiences are engaging with gaming influencers. We took a look at a number of different platforms where gaming influencers offer content up to their fans. And really important to note, this is global data. The only thing it doesn't include are Chinese exclusive streaming platforms, since those would have only been relevant to one country. It would have kind of skewed results a bit. But really interesting to see, certainly Twitch, which everyone here, at least in the States, connects with that live gaming content and audience streaming type. We see that globally, about 1 in 4 gaming influencer fans are engaging with these influencers on Twitch. Now that may feel low to some of us in the US, and certainly that figure is higher in this market, but important to note that when we look at that index versus just how people engage with any type of influencer, we see that Twitch is, by far most likely to be more commonly used among gaming influencers and followers and their fans than any other platform type. But it does kind of bring to mind a couple of things I think are always important to talk about when we mention gaming influencers. So Twitch is very much concentrated on that kind of live game streaming, longer form content type format. But we do continue to see, and we have some data in the full reports that point to this. YouTube certainly #1 from just a global reach perspective, as well as both live and even more importantly, video on demand, non-live content continues to be a behemoth in the gaming space and even specifically the gaming influencer space. So still these kind of classic social online video content platforms are major players in the gaming influencer economy. And this also extends to Instagram, where a lot of gaming influencers are engaging with their fans, and even Facebook, where we actually see, especially in APAC markets, more engagement even with live content on that platform for gaming, even though in the West, we may not think of it as a primary platform. And then we are seeing TikTok rise up as well here in the past year or so with a lot of gaming influencers, esports players and personalities as a new way that they're engaging with younger fans. So just taking a look at other ways that we can profile users and consumers of gaming content. Here, what we've done is taken data from YouGov profiles, so our ongoing consumer profiling tool, and looked at different statements that Twitch users in the US agree with, and indexed that, which is what we have on the right-hand side here, to the broader adult 18 to 34 population to basically understand, #1, kind of who are Twitch consumers, what do they feel, what are their tendencies, and maybe to even figure out what underlying beliefs they have led them to interact with a platform like Twitch, and then to understand how that may make them different from their peers in the broader 18 to 34 space. I'm not going to read all these different statements off one by one, but I think there's some interesting thematics that come up. Certainly a lot around digital native, digital first consumption, as well as shorter form consumption. So things like watching highlights of sports as a good way to consume that content, wanting to buy things online rather than in stores. I think the stat about checking product reviews before buying, we've seen, we don't have the data here, but it's in the full report that Twitch, a lot of consumers are now looking to Twitch for video game reviews and instead of the traditional gaming review sites. So certainly some interesting behaviors there, as well as some attitudes about sponsorship that I think are, for those engaged in the esports space, really important to think about. So more sensitive to if a brand makes sense or not as a sponsor in sports or esports. As well as paying attention to, or I'm sorry, as well as sponsorship, helping to keep a company socially relevant. And then one more that I wanted to point out, because it's such a hot topic lately, something that is maybe food for thought for some of you on the line. Twitch users are much more likely to believe that online gambling should be legal. So as we start to think about potential integrations, and certainly here in the US, the opening up of that marketplace, a really kind of thought-provoking thing to keep in mind. And then finally, I pointed this out earlier, just the strong difference in different markets in terms of how influencer followers are engaging with their influencers' content. And I think, maybe the big thing to point out here is the trends in Indonesia, where you see that kind of traditional YouTube, Instagram, Facebook being much more common among the gaming influencer fan base than a Twitch, which is still kind of starting to put its roots down in some of those APAC markets. And then finally, quickly, I think there's been a lot of kind of questions lately about what's more important to followers of gaming influencers? Is it the personality, or is it the platform that they found that personality on? And more importantly, we're starting to see a lot of exclusive deals being made. Certainly Twitch has a number of exclusive streamers on their platform, but YouTube is starting to bring more exclusive streamers on, including Dr. Lupo and Tin the Tapman, which in our full report, we have some interesting analysis on. But we actually went out and asked gaming influencer fans how likely they are to switch channels if their favorite influencer moved. And I think the results are really interesting. At a high level, the vast majority, so about 9 in 10, believe that yes, they would follow that influencer, but it's not necessarily a yes no matter what. In fact, only about a quarter say they would follow yes no matter what. Almost a third say they'd follow, but most likely won't watch them as much as they used to, which kind of points to that importance of platform in terms of, people going to Twitch as a destination for watching content and hopping around to different influencers or discovering different influencers while they're on the platform. And changing that type of behavior can sometimes be difficult, even if it is, a really popular influencer that's moving over. And then the other, of course, which is less relevant to moves like Lupo and Tim, where they're moving to another free platform, YouTube. But when we, with, for example, the shutdown of Mixer that we saw previously, one of the key things there was kind of that requirement for a subscription to be able to engage with, for example, content from Ninja and that sort of thing. And we do see that that's a strong barrier for a number of fans of gaming influencers if their influencer was to move to a more gated platform. Okay, so the last section here, we want to take a look at how marketers, advertisers, sponsors, et cetera, can leverage the value that gaming influencers have to their fans for themselves. So I think one important thing to understand before figuring out how to use that value is where does the value come from, and why are influencer fans engaging with influencers in the first place. This survey, as well as the one that I mentioned on the previous slide, actually comes from a cool tool that we have called YouGov Chat, where we reach out to respondents for surveys in a very kind of chat-friendly format, where it basically looks like they're talking to someone through text message. So we ran this in the US and UK, and one of the things that we asked all these respondents who are gaming influencer followers specifically is, what do they like about the influencers they follow? And it's really interesting to see that things like the games they play, their gaming skills, fall in the middle or even the second half of the list. And what's more important to them are things that are attractive for any type of influencer: their sense of humor, their personalities, their overall entertainment value. These are things that stand out and that really keep fans coming back to their favorite influencers after they discover them for the first time. So discovery may be through a new game they're playing, or the fact that they play a favorite game of theirs, but what keeps them coming back and kind of builds that connection to them is much more about how they get along with them, if they feel like, you know, they would be a friend of theirs, and certainly the ability to chat with them, all things that platforms today do a really great job of promoting and enhancing for gaming influencers. Trust is also a huge factor. So again, I won't go through all the data for all these different markets, but we asked consumers in our survey of 17 different markets how much they trust the influencers that they follow. And the percentages you see here are the percent who say that they completely or somewhat trust influencers. And on average, gaming influencer followers globally are more likely to trust the influencers they follow than those who follow any type of influencer. And that also holds true in the US, even more so. So 76% of gaming influencer followers trust their influencer, the influencers they're fans of, versus only 60% at a broader level. So really, when you're thinking about, you know, a brand that is engaging with this audience and trying to market to them through gaming influencers, this data point really stands out to me as an important reason to take a look at gaming influencers, because they do kind of build that inherent trust with their fans at a higher rate than many other influencer types around the world. We also see some interesting trends among gaming influencer followers as it relates to advertising and sponsorship. And I think this really just continues to show how engaging with gaming influencer fans who are also gamers and love gaming, as well as love the personalities they follow, is really a sweet spot in tapping into not only what they love and who they care about, but some of these kind of like sentiments and intrinsic feelings they have about advertising, marketing, and being sold products. So things like advertising does help them to choose what to purchase. They are paying attention to advertising at higher rates versus the broader population. It just needs to be the right type of advertising. Even more so in the esports space, gaming influencer followers are much more likely to indicate that if you sponsor their favorite team, they'll buy your product. So kind of that loyalty, and again, that trust is something that is really important to them when you're tapping into a passion point. And then things like they enjoy watching advertisements with their favorite celebrities, which for this demographic is influencers and personalities more than anything else. But they also want things to be entertaining, and they're going to be blocking traditional ads. So when you kind of roll all of that up, it shows that not only are gaming influencer followers trusting influencers more, but influencers are also a great way to reach them in a way that they're open to and that they're going to respond positively to. I wanted to throw in a little non-US data example, since this is a broader Americas webinar. So this is actually looking at data in Brazil. And I think an important thing that sometimes we lose sight of when we're thinking about brands in the gaming influencer space and non-endemic brands, so kind of non-gaming brands getting engaged. one thing that has really been a trend that's risen in recent years is gaming personalities becoming the main way that gamers find out about new games that are coming out. And you see this quote here from one respondent that we interviewed in our chat platform. They just flat out say gaming influencers are better news outlets for reviews and footage. And that's something that is important to continue to keep in mind, that they can be used for that kind of traditional game marketing as well as non-traditional gaming brands. Let's see. Speaking of non-traditional gaming brands, I'm going to close off today before we jump to the Q&A with a couple of examples of interesting activations that we've seen in the gaming space and how kind of them being featured, or even in the case of this one that we're going to look at first, being talked about on gaming platforms helped to elevate that product among gaming content and gaming viewers and gaming influencer followers. So in September of this year, Oreo ran a really cool kind of limited campaign where they leveraged the Pokemon IP and had a partnership with different Pokemon themed packaging for Oreos. And part of that was also fans were able to create their own packaging and order kind of customized Oreos with different Pokemon imaging and IP leveraged. So what we're looking at here is data from our YouGov brand index tool, which is a syndicated daily tracker where I mentioned earlier, we're tracking thousands of brands around the world on a daily basis. And we can look at that data among all different types of consumers, including, in this particular case, Twitch users. In our report, we saw that Twitch, that on Twitch kind of during the period that that this launch happened, Oreo was one of the most talked about within the Twitch chat platform, specifically brands on Twitch. So we wanted to dig into that a little bit more and see kind of how that impacted Twitch users' long-term perceptions of the Oreo brand. So up here, what we're looking at is the percent of Twitch users in purple versus just general 18 to 34-year-olds, so kind of their demographic peers, so that we're taking into account broader media campaigns that were targeted at that particular demographic. And looking at the percent of each of those groups that indicated they heard something positive about the Oreo brand in the past 2 weeks. And what you can see is right when this campaign around the Oreo Pokemon activation went off and Twitch influencers started to talk about this, consumers just organically started to talk about this on Twitch. We see a strong increase, almost 40% of Twitch users during that time period saying they heard something positive about the Oreo brand. And what's neat is that when we look at the impression metric that we track, so seeing if overall consumers have a positive or negative impression of the different brands that we track, we see a similar theme where actually during that time period, the Oreo brand was perceived as having a better or a more positive impression among Twitch users versus broader 18 to 34-year-olds because of that activation. And lastly, what most marketers are probably interested in and the holy grail in marketing is, of course, translating all of that to sales. And what's really neat is we see, again, right at kind of that launch period in September. Sorry, I should have mentioned these dates are in European format, so day, month, year. But at that point in September, we actually see Twitch users being more likely to have purchased an Oreo product in the past 30 days. And I think what's even more exciting and encouraging for the Oreo brand is that continued, not just during that kind of September activation period, but well after into November. So really shows that, it's not just buzz, but that when you connect positively with an audience, you see the results on the purchase side as well. And then lastly, a similar story, but another great one to highlight is Chipotle and all of the activations that they've been doing with gaming influencers. Hopefully some of you have seen those over the past year and even previously to that. So really kind of two key things that we focus on in our overall measurement of Chipotle, working with their agency in these activations, RevXP, who is a YouGov client and has done some kind of really great tracking and measurement and overall strategy through data for Chipotle as a brand. So earlier this year, Chipotle launched their new quesadilla product with a number of different gaming streamers and basically focused specifically on online ordering and created these special menu items, created a special code for people who saw streams that were sponsored by Chipotle from their favorite gaming influencers to use to purchase the product and order it for delivery or order it online for pickup. The first interesting thing to point out here is that this was a really kind of well-driven strategy because we see that using YouGov profiles data that versus the national representative audience of US adults, gaming streaming viewers, and even versus broader 18 to 34-year-olds are much more likely to use food delivery services. So the first important thing is that Chipotle and RevXP really looked at, okay, what is the right way to activate this new launch that is going to align with how our consumers are purchasing our products, especially during a pandemic when less people are in person. But the result is pretty cool. And what we're looking at here is that purchase rate data again. So consumers who have purchased Chipotle in the past 30 days, the purple is people who in the US who view game streams. So that could be across YouTube, Twitch, primarily for US, those two platforms, both of which Chipotle activated on during this time period. And then the green again is that 18 to 34-year-olds. So in March, the quesadilla launch campaign went off, and you can see almost an immediate result where game streamers were much less likely to have purchased Chipotle products in the past 30 days leading up to that. And then as this campaign kicked off, we see a significant spike where the game streaming audience becomes at those levels of broader 18 to 34-year-olds during that period. Then the Chipotle Challenger Series launched, which is essentially a Fortnite competition sponsored and managed and put on by Chipotle on Twitch and also rebroadcasted on YouTube. And you can see that that helped Chipotle to maintain these higher purchase rates among the game streaming audience during that time period. Then when the Challenger Series went dark, you see a bit of a drop off, some overall kind of summer executions that did really well. And then come July, when Challenger Series 2 launched, boom, purchase rates actually ended up exceeding the average rates for 18 to 34-year-olds for Chipotle. So what this shows is, not only did Chipotle have a couple of cool ideas, but they really, number one, targeted them properly and spaced them properly to make sure that they were having an ongoing conversation with gaming streamers, and instead of just kind of one-offs where they get a quick blip or a quick spike in sales and then things went back to normal. So just two examples, certainly many more out there, and certainly happy to have conversations about some of what YouGov can do to measure these types of things for brands moving forward. All right, that is all of the content that we had prepared to show, but I'm now going to leave it to Ben to relay any questions that we had before we end the webinar.
Thanks, Nicole. That was great. I definitely should have had lunch before this. All this talk of Oreos and Chipotle, I am suddenly very hungry. Really insightful presentation as always. So we do have a few questions that came in, and just a few minutes to cover here. Reminder to everyone, if you have any other questions you want to ask, drop them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. So our first question is from Olivia, and she asked, do you think that the trends in your gaming influence report will change as we emerge from the pandemic? It's actually two questions related to kind of the post-pandemic outlook.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's one of the things that we've seen is that levels, both in terms of viewing gaming content as well as just playing games, have leveled off a bit kind of post-pandemic, or I'm not even sure we can call it post-pandemic right now, but as things are starting to kind of return, especially in-person socializing, to return to pre-pandemic levels, but everything still from what we're seeing is elevated versus pre-pandemic. So what we've seen is kind of like a small increase in overall kind of net engagement with gaming content and gaming. But I think what we've seen from our gaming influencer data is that those particular influencers have definitely gained strong followings kind of during the pandemic, that we expect, even though fans may not be engaging with the content quite as often, we expect that overall kind of levels or reach of gaming influencers to stay strong and really, from all the trends we're seeing, continue to grow.
So once you like get them through the door, you don't expect them to kind of walk back out.
Exactly. Yeah, there may be, they may be watching a little bit less content on a weekly basis or things like that. But if you think about, reaching them via an Instagram post or a TikTok, or people are already engaging with that content so frequently that the likelihood you're still reaching them, on a weekly basis or things like that is still really high.
Cool. And kind of on a related point, are there particular platforms, we saw, Twitch and YouTube are kind of still the primary ones for streamers, but other kind of upcoming trends in either social platforms or live stream platforms that you see kind of on the horizon among gaming influencers specifically?
Yeah, so I guess just I'll focus on the US, since I think that's where most folks on the line right now are from. So I think a couple things. We're definitely seeing TikTok gaining in a big way in terms of obviously a totally different type of content, but what's cool is that it's a unique form of content. So I think one of the things we've seen in the past is that gaming influencers, and this extends to esports teams as well, esports rights holders have kind of had challenges of trying to figure out the right balance and difference of content across all the different platforms that they can put things out on. So you would tend to see a lot of YouTube videos being exactly the same as what's posted on Twitter, and then it's just a link through and things like that. But TikTok has really offered a brand new form of content to these influencers that they haven't that they haven't been putting out before, and it's kind of adding an incremental or new voice to their conversation. Whereas I think one of the things we're seeing, and one thing I'm going to be keeping an eye on, is Twitter, because I think both from a demographic standpoint, kind of that younger Gen Z is maybe not as engaged with Twitter, but also kind of these more interactive forms of things like Snapchat or TikTok are starting to gain more traction in the gaming space. I'm going to be watching Twitter closely to see if we see any declines there, and they're a smart company, what they're going to do to kind of reinvent the type of content and formats that they have for gaming followers.
Yeah, and certainly going through some changes right now. There's a question here that you and I have talked about in the past, kind of off of influencers, but more general. What's your response when faced with the kind of stereotypical idea about video games and supposed kind of health disadvantages, and if companies are kind of concerned about that when considering the end of the space?
Yeah, so one of the things that I love about the gaming space, and I would say across, or even more specifically, the gaming influencer space, is how much variety there is out there for brands to attach to. You hear these big names like the Ninjas and Lupos and Tims of the world, but that is not the only type of influencer that a brand needs to connect to. And this is where, it certainly takes some work, but there are influencers who lead a really healthy lifestyle, who focus on being active, who, put 90% of their content out there about non-gaming things and 10% gaming. So I certainly get that. And I would be the first to say that not every influencer is going to be the right match for every brand. But I would also say that there's a really strong likelihood that there is an influencer or multiple influencers out there that can really match with the brand's values, if the homework is done to find that and to make sure that everyone's aligned on what the output needs to be.
Yeah, that's great. And there are a lot of examples out there of streamers who are very health conscious, actually, and talk about it a lot, and mental health as well.
Yeah, exactly.
We have time for one last question, and kind of a related point about honing in on a more specific cohort of an audience. What's your approach to using influencer broadcasting at a more local level?
Yeah, it's an important one, because you think of these platforms like YouTube and Twitch, and in theory, audiences that are out there that people are broadcasting to are global. And that's where I think, certainly viewership data in the industry to date has frankly fallen a little bit short in terms of being able to report on a local or market specific or regional level like we are used to in the TV space, et cetera. But that's where I actually look to lean more on data sources like YouGov, where we're collecting data on a market by market basis, of course, trying to be really consistent across everything that we collect, so it's easy to compare across markets. But that's where kind of that consumer sentiment data can become really valuable, where we can actually look in at, okay, what are the most followed titles or channels or whatever it may be in terms of what consumers are telling us in a particular market. And then most importantly, it's not just about reach, it's about impact as well. And so, kind of also doing the research and the work after the fact to look at what the impact among local consumers is at the end of the day, what's going to be most impactful or most valuable. If you're spending an amount of money that you're comfortable with and you're seeing the return even among just your local consumers, then if there's been a little bit of waste in the spend, like that could be okay for the brand, but the work has to be done to be able to kind of make that calculation and understand if the ROI is there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we want to live a little bit of time here at the end. Do have a couple other questions here about kind of different types of content and integrations brand can bring into the influencer space. And if there are certain platforms that are better for specific types of content. I don't know if maybe in a minute you can sum that up, but it's kind of a broad question. We could follow up with the listeners later.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way they go together in just that, the same type of content that works on Twitter is not going to work on Instagram, is not going to work on Twitch. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think gaming influencers, and certainly especially on the esports side of things, like are just kind of starting to realize and get into the groove of what content differentiation looks like. And that's as much by getting it right platform by platform as it is kind of getting it right at different points in the consumer conversation. And that can be a combination of long form sponsored streams, ad placements, mid rolls in YouTube videos on demand. They can all kind of play into an overall strategy. But my view is always that it's a really kind of brand specific and KPI driven decision that needs to be made. So.
Yeah, you need some good insights to help to guide those decisions. Well, that's all for us today, folks. We appreciate you tuning in and spending an hour with us. Look out for recordings coming to your inbox soon. And you can always reach out to myself or Nicole with any follow-up questions or if you want to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you.